Here we go. People are rolling in the door. So, Jackie, what's in your glass tonight?
I knew this was coming. I've got a glass of water.
Oh my goodness!
I know.
It's cocktails.
I know. I'm not in my usual habitat. I didn't have the resources at my hands.
And Meredith, what are you drinking tonight?
I'm drinking a cocktail based on absinthe called a Green Beast, which I make for myself once a year. And it contains absinthe, of course, which is meant to make you go mad, and Pernod and lime juice. So there's my Green Beast.
Wow.
I wish I was in your house.
Why only once a year?
Well, I make it for a particular, the Australia Day weekend down at Taralga. I always have a cocktail party and serve Green Beasts to all my friends down at Taralga.
Wow.
It's
I've got a gin and tonic, which I've decided to go fancy, and I infused with some, mandarin was only fruit we had in our house tonight. So
yeah, well, I've just got a slice of apple. It should be cucumber.
Ooh, cucumber. I'll have to try that one out one time.
The Green Beast.
Yeah.
My friends all turn into weird beasts once they've had it.
We maybe after tonight we should send everybody a link to your cocktail recipe, Meredith.
Yes, it's and there's another one called a Green Monster too, because absinthe has this history of making people go mad, because of course it was originally made with what's the name of that, the stuff that wormwood. It was originally made with wormwood, which actually did make you go mad. And that's why a lot of the artists in Paris all died early and went crazy, because they were drinking absinthe made with wormwood. But now it's not made with that.
Right. Well, thank goodness. What's the thing with absinthe? Don't you do like a thing where you burn sugar or something to go?
Right, it melts over it. There was an absinthe cafe in Sydney, I think, where you could go and do the full experience.
We always intended to get to the absinthe cafe in Sydney, but we always got held up, never got there.
All right, we've got a few more people rolling in, and we'll kick off in about a minute. Thanks so much for being here. I hope everybody at home has also, in the spirit of cocktails, actually got a cocktail or some sort of drink anyway. This is a very important part of the event.
It is.
Yes, I love the way you do. This one reminded me of your struggles, scabs and schooners.
All my friends in the environment movement don't know my sordid past. The pub crawl that I created to meet girls.
You just know how to run a good event, that's all.
Well, it worked. I met my wife at Struggles, Scabs and Schooners.
Did you really? That is very funny.
Yeah. Mission accomplished. That's why we stopped doing it. I got what I needed. All right, it's on 5:30, so let's make a start. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Nature's Happy Hour and this week's Cocktails, Controversy and Conservation. My name's Chris Gambian. I'm Chief Executive of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. Now, as you all know, activism is a concept that started 9 years ago on Twitter. But before it was cool, Jack Mundey from the Builders Labourers Federation was locked in epic struggles for workers and the environment alike. At the same time, a bunch of pinko radicals from Hunters Hill were locked in a battle to save a parcel of remnant bushland on the Parramatta River in Sydney known as Kelly's Bush. The Unionists and the Conservationists got together and the world's first green ban was imposed. We lost Jack 2 weeks ago, so this is a great time for us to reflect on his legacy of bringing together Unionists and environmentalists. Jackie Mumford, Jack left a pretty extraordinary legacy.
Yeah, it's pretty inspiring to think, what's been saved thanks to workers withholding labour. Nature and built heritage across Sydney is clearly an important thing for everyone, not just greenies like me. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Meredith tonight.
Well, but you should disclose, though, that you are the union delegate at NCC, so you're a bit of a watermelon, right?
Yes, and I know how to organise, so watch out.
Now, before we meet our guest tonight, hit us with those ground rules again.
Can do. So for any newcomers to Cocktails tonight, welcome, especially those of you from the union movement. It's great to have you here. The first rule of Cocktails is, of course, grab a cocktail. And we're recording this evening, so if you miss any of our wonderful presentation, you'll be able to watch it back. And if you've got a question, make sure you ask yourself first, is this actually a question? We won't be taking any grandstanding. And if it is, type it in the chat.
If they're good questions, we will read them out, but only if they're good questions.
But honestly, you can just sit there and listen. It's 30 minutes and we've got a great speaker.
Now, we're recording tonight's talk, as Jackie just said, so you can watch it later on Facebook, or as somebody pointed out to me during the week, not everybody's on Facebook, so you can also watch it on YouTube.
And remember, you can follow the chat on Twitter using the hashtag Nature's Happy Hour. And please follow at Nature New South Wales and at Chris Gambian, because Chris desperately needs more friends and it's getting a bit pathetic.
Yes, please follow me on Twitter. Now, importantly, if you are enjoying yourself tonight, please take a moment and go to nature.org.au and send us some money.
Because as we know, koalas grow on trees, but money does not.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Meredith Bergmann is an activist, an author, an academic, and a former president of the New South Wales Legislative Council. She was a key member of the anti-apartheid movement, the feminist movement, the peace movement, the human rights movement, the union movement, and the environment movement. She is literally the original red under the bed. Meredith Bergmann, very, very much welcome to you.
G'day, Chris.
So, so the green bans, where did it all start?
Well, I'd like to begin today, first of all, by acknowledging the Gadigal, as I always do. This is their land. But the green bans really start, I think really you've got to acknowledge that it starts with Jack Mundey. The builders, labourers really did change the face of Sydney. And it starts with Jack. First slide, please. Jack comes down from the, there's one of the famous Jack Mundey stances. He comes down from the Atherton Tablelands to play rugby league for Parramatta, doesn't make the cut, so he ends up working on the tools. And he decides to be involved with the union, that he's being a builder's labourer. And he, for a decade, he fought for democratic control of the union against a very right-wing, corrupt leadership. He was helped in this by Joe Owens. Next slide, please. Oh, there's Jack again. This was very typical Jack with a bullhorn. But he was helped by Joe Owens. Next slide. This is, you'll see Joe. This is Joe, who was secretary of the union after Jack. And also the president of the union was Bob Pringle. And it was a very important leadership trio, the Mundey, Owens, Pringle trio. Bob was in the left of the Labor Party, and Joe and Jack were in the Communist Party. It worked really well in that way. By 1968, after 10 years of struggle, they gained the leadership of the union, and they began to institute really democratic practices. Like the most important one was limited tenure of office, which meant that you could only keep a union position for 2 terms, which would be 6 years, and then you had to stand down. So even Jack had to stand down from being secretary of the union. They didn't accept pay when there was an industry strike on. The organisers didn't take pay. The organisers were only paid the award wage of the builders' labourers. They made certain that there were translators at all their mass meetings because, of course, the building industry at that time was extremely multicultural. What they were facing in that early 70s period was huge overdevelopment, a massive corruption. The government of the time, the Aston government of the time, was corrupt. There was no legislation to protect any buildings or green space. It was only when Neville Wran got into power in 1976 that the Environment Protection Act and the Heritage Act actually were legislated. Before that time, if you owned the most historic building in Australia, you could pull it down and no one could stop them. So you can see it was a really rackety period of development in Sydney. And Jack started talking about the social responsibility of labour. He kept saying to the labourers, you have to think about what you're doing with your labour. And as Chris has pointed out, the battlers for Kelly's Bush, the next slide, please. The battlers for Kelly's Bush, there they are. That was always quite made fun of, that they were the middle-class matrons of Hunters Hill. They were trying to save the last bit of natural bushland on Sydney Harbour. And no one else would help them, and so they asked the builders' labourers, this communist-led macho union, for help. And the labourers agreed, and that's how 1971, that was the first green ban. And in quick succession after that, next slide please, there was the ban on the 2 expressways that were going to go right through Glebe. They were going to make Glebe into 3 little islands with 2 huge expressways through. And then there was Woolloomooloo. Woolloomooloo was just going to be high-rise. Centennial Park was going to be a giant sporting complex. Martin Place, most of those lovely old buildings in Martin Place were going to come down. And then, of course, there was the Rocks. Next slide, please. Now, the Rocks became a very famous green band, because the Rocks, as we know it today, that famous, beautiful old historic precinct, was going to be razed to the ground. Now, I love this photo, because not only is Jack there in the middle looking as wonderful and defiant as ever, but that's me behind him in the excellent pantsuit. And if you could see that in colour, you'd really recognise quite how wonderful that pantsuit was. It was orange, yellow and turquoise. Now, next slide, please. This is Jack being arrested. He always managed to look quite sort of, not exactly elegant, but this is Jack being arrested at the Rocks. The next slide, please. This is the famous photo of him being carried away by the police. And the funny thing about Jack was his charm was so extraordinary that even the police liked him. So the Rocks was a very significant ban. And then there was the Victoria Street ban. Next slide, please. Up at the Victoria Street, up at the Cross. And that was where squatting occurred. And in this photograph, you can see the chimneys where the squatters are just sitting up on the chimney tops. No safety measures, nothing. It was so dangerous. I was involved with Victoria Street. I actually got arrested at Victoria Street, but I certainly wasn't going up on any chimney tops. Next slide, please. And there, of course, it's where Juanita Nielsen, the Mark Foy's heiress, who ran the local community newspaper, she was abducted, disappeared. Her body has never been found, and no one has ever been successfully charged with her actual murder. A very tragic figure in the whole green band story. By 1974, there were 54 green bands holding up $5 billion worth of development in 1970s money terms. So you can imagine how much money that would be today. They were attacked by the media. The Sydney Morning Herald has now a bit rewritten history and claims to have supported the green bands, but they actually wrote 5 editorials in 12 days opposing aspects of the green bands. But the builders' labourers were not just about the environment. They were also very involved with the other issues of the time. They were very supportive of women. Here are the women builders' labourers marching in a Women's Day march. The builders' labourers' leadership organised for women to come into the union because it was a very well-paid industry and women had been shut out of it. There were women organisers. The builders' labourers also put a ban on Sydney University because they were refusing to allow a women's studies course. I mean, imagine these things happening today. The labourers were also very involved with Aboriginal rights. Next slide, please. This is one of my favourite photos. This is a banner advertising the moratorium for black rights. This is in 1972, and a dogman called Roy Bishop put that up on the crane. He got arrested for doing it. He got bailed out and he went straight back out and put the banner back up again and got arrested again. So he was arrested twice in in the one day for that. But they also, the builders labourers also had Aboriginal organisers, and of course, most importantly, they put a ban on what is now the block in Redfern, and until the Whitlam government got into power and bought the land from bought the buildings from the developer and gave them back to the Redfern Aboriginal community. And it's always called the first successful land rights claim in Australia, and that was all done through the builders labourers. The next slide, please. The students, of course, were very, very supportive of the builders labourers, and particularly the LGBTIQ students. What was called a pink ban was put on the Macquarie University because one of their residential colleges had expelled a student called Jeremy Fisher for being gay. And that pink ban was very successful because eventually the student was told he could come back into the residential hall. Now, Jack and his union saved Sydney, and we've got to keep remembering they were a bunch of pick and shovel, lowest of the low really, builders labourers, and they vote, and the rank and file voted every time to support those green bans. They had such faith in their leadership that they really put their own jobs in danger in order to support the people of Sydney. Now, next slide, please. Jack continued his environmental activism well into his 80s. Here he is. This is him at the demonstration to protect the Sirius building, which was about trying to keep low-income earners and social housing in the inner city at Millers Point. A very important demonstration. There he is in 2016. And next, now, the interesting thing about the green bans is that there's still huge interest in them, not only around Australia and particularly among students, but all around the world. I wrote my PhD thesis on the green bans, but then we wrote a book about it in 1998, and it became so popular around the world that I was still getting queries from international academics for the last 20 years. So a few years ago, the publishers actually republished the book because they discovered that it was selling for $300 on Amazon. So they republished the book. Next slide, please. And there it is. It was republished a couple of years ago, still available. Green bans, sorry about this. This sounds like a very crude ad for the book, but I do think this is very funny, having it there stuck between Modern Women and Insomniac City. So if you want to know more about the builders labourers, you can get it through that book, or there's Jack's own book, his autobiography, or a really wonderful little book written in the 70s called Taming the Concrete Jungle by Pete Thomas. So Jack has just been offered, Jack's widow Judy has just been offered a state memorial service by Gladys Berejiklian, and so that as soon as COVID lockdown is over, we're going to have a wonderful, wonderful piss up and all remember Jack. Thank you.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thanks, thanks so much, Meredith. Jackie, I think there are some good questions coming through. Do you want to fire some off?
Yeah, I think one question here is, when was the last green ban and when will the next one be? And I think that's, you know, when you were speaking just then, Meredith, you said, you know, imagine that happening today. And I think that question is quite pertinent. When will the next one be? And you know, what do you think is the difference sort of between then and the sort of climate that we're working in now?
Look, the last green ban that I see as the green ban period was beginning of 1975, because in March 1975, the federal leadership of the builders labourers, supported by, unfortunately, some of the other building unions, came in and smashed the New South Wales builders labourers because they were just so threatened by so much of what the Mundey, Owens, Pringle leadership was doing. There have been what are called green bans since, But how I distinguish the green bands of the Mundey Owens Pringle period is that they were physically defended. Those guys and those and the girls and the residents stood there and were dragged away, and that was the main distinction. What happens now is that sometimes the building unions will put on what they call a green ban, and that allows time to work out some other sort of solution. And often it's a good solution, and sometimes it fails. But the green bans of that 70s period really was about physically defending the actual ban.
Yeah, right. Thanks. Someone's just put in the chat there the example of the Bondi Pavilion as a recent example of
yes,
the FMEU imposing a green ban. So yeah,
and very much, and that was about giving time for a political solution to be sorted out, and thank goodness that. And of course, Jack was involved in that ban too.
Yeah, right. And did they ever say, there's just another question there about the criteria around imposing a green ban. I'm just wondering if they ever sort of said no to areas that it wasn't sort of deemed important enough.
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Their criteria was they had to be asked by the community, and it had to go to a mass meeting of the builders' labourers, and the mass meeting had to agree to a ban. And there were some bans that were quite controversial. For instance, the ban on Macquarie University about the gay student was really, I mean, we're talking about the 1970s, and we're talking about, builders' labourers. So there was quite a lot of, they didn't have particularly advanced views about the world, some of them. But what was wonderful about that old leadership was they fought it out in the pubs. They'd argue in the pubs about it. And in the end, the membership, the rank and file, voted for that ban. There was another ban at a place called Diamond Bay in the eastern suburbs, where the locals wanted their, I think it was a swimming pool, to be protected. And there was huge argument about that because the membership thought it was about them giving up their jobs for the ruling class, that sort of thing. And so, yes, there were arguments about the bans. I can't remember any ban actually being knocked back, but there were huge arguments about some of them.
Meredith, recently you and I had a conversation about the bans extending to other parts of Australia, and we were talking about Canberra. Can you tell us a bit about the sort of spread of the green ban idea around Australia and maybe even around the world?
Well, in Canberra, of course, they ended up putting a ban on the tower at Black Mountain. On the whole, the bans were most successful in Sydney because of those conditions that I was talking about, where you had a corrupt government that was really, and the development push was all in Sydney. That was where the hot money from overseas was coming in. Newcastle, there were a number of very successful bans in Newcastle too, because of course the labourers' unions have always been very strong in Newcastle. A few bans down in Wollongong. There were the federal leadership under Norm Gallagher, who was not my favourite person, did put on bans in Melbourne. There was one about a swimming pool, and I think there was one over a markets. So there were a few bans in Melbourne. But on the whole, it was a Sydney phenomenon because it was Sydney that was getting the first wave of wholesale destruction of suburbs, really, when you look at it. Overseas, Jack went overseas in 76, I think it was, and there was a famous ban on the Birmingham post office, which he managed to save. But Britain on the whole was better about keeping its historic buildings. They actually understood about heritage, and I think they even had legislation in a way that we didn't. But of course, it was Jack who used the term green bans for the first time, and Petra Kelly the German environmentalist, was so, she came out to Australia, I met her, and she was so taken with the idea of green bans that when she went back to Germany, she, in fact, the party that she helped found was called the Greens. So it's really worldwide, the Greens get their name from the green bans.
Wow. There's one of the things that I think is extraordinary about the green bans is this idea of conservationists and unionists being able to sort of come together and a bit of an unlikely pairing there. Particularly, you think about the activists at Hunters Hill. What do you think are the lessons of the green bans for our struggles today? Where there's a lot of the same things are still going on, and I know the industrial situation is quite profoundly different than it was 45 years ago. But is there something you think we can take away from Jack's legacy?
Yes, Jack always used to refer to the green bans as being the enlightened middle class and the enlightened working class coming together to campaign around the environment. And he was very clear. He thought in class terms, but he could see that they had the same need and the same goal. And I think today, it's that whole thing about don't think of even miners as not being environmentally aware, and certainly farmers and people like that. I'm always amazed when I'm out in the sticks at how environmentally aware and how keen on, they get all teary-eyed when they see a kangaroo sort of thing. That I think there is a lot more middle ground than sometimes we think there is.
Great. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I've certainly been looking forward to this particular talk, and the fact that Jack passed away a couple of weeks ago is literally a coincidence. We had planned this before that, and I'm so glad that we've been able to make this time. Now, at the end of these sessions, we always play a little game, and normally we ask the guest to participate in a quiz, but this week, because you, Meredith, got such a kind of reputation for your ratbaggery over the years, I thought we might put Jackie Mumford to the test this week. What do you think, Jackie? Are you up for a little game?
I'm up for it. Keen to learn more about Meredith.
Okay, here we go. There's 3 questions. So, which of the following world leaders has Meredith not met? Paul Keating, Ban Ki-moon, Bill Clinton, Fidel Castro, the Queen, Prince Charles and the rest of the royal family, and Nelson Mandela.
Wow, the whole royal family. That's a big one. Lot of names in there. Wow. Oh my goodness. Well, I feel like the Queen and the royals, yeah, you probably would have met them. Clinton, I believe it. I'm going to go, you haven't met Castro.
Meredith?
I haven't met Paul Keating.
No way!
I've met all the others, including Castro.
That was a trick question, not fair.
Invitation to Paul Keating to come onto a cocktails to talk to meet Meredith for the first time. Okay, question number 2. What did Meredith replace the portrait of the Queen and Prince Philip in the parliamentary dining room with? Was it A, a picture of Tony Lockett and Che Guevara, B, a picture of John and Jeanette Howard, or C, a picture of Karl Marx?
Oh, it has to be Marx. Please tell me it's Karl Marx.
Meredith?
It was Tony Lockett and Che Guevara.
You're not doing well.
I got into trouble for it.
I've got to do my study next time.
Okay, final question. For what offence did Meredith get sentenced to 2 months in jail for? Was it A, running onto the pitch of the SCG during a Springboks game, B, chaining herself to the fence of New South Wales Parliament, or C, shoplifting?
Oh, look, it's not going to be without political statement. I think I'll have to go with A, running into the field with the Springboks.
Yes, it was. And I have to keep telling people I was fully clothed. And the interesting thing was that we did manage to stop the game. We were the only actual act of defiance that stopped the games. And of course, as you know, we eventually stopped the all-white racist sporting tours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Meredith, and thanks, Jackie.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith.
And tonight, I feel like it would be remiss of me not to take a moment to reflect on some of the events that have been taking place in the United States this week. The death of George Floyd was a confronting reminder of the racism that exists in the United States and the rest of the world. A reminder, but not at all the beginning or end of that story. In Australia, we're reminded of black deaths in custody. Again, a reminder, but not at all the beginning or the end of the extreme and casual racism in Australia. I try not to talk about race very much. My skin colour doesn't define me, and compared to most, my skin colour has not been a barrier for me. But I do occupy a position of privilege, and tonight I'd be wasting that privilege if I didn't overcome my own anxieties about my own heritage and not say anything. The Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales is a movement of over 60,000 people from all sorts of walks of life. Our interest is in nature, to be sure, but our community is made up of people. And when someone in our community is hurting and we fail to act, then we fail as a community. Brown and black people in our community are hurting. We didn't start hurting with the death of George Floyd, and we won't stop hurting next week after the hashtags have run their course and we all move on to other things. The fight for racial justice is uncomfortable. It is ugly and it's painful. It's not waged with a stylish and earnest social media post, but I guess they can't hurt. It's not waged either with these heartfelt confessions of guilt. It's not waged with scolding other people for their moral failings without examining our own actions either. Honestly, I don't know how it's waged. I don't claim any special expertise. I know that some of the people I admire most in the world are white people who've been on the front line of that fight since long before I was born. Jack Mundey was one of those people, and Meredith Bergmann is another. I've been thinking a lot today about what the right response is. I've been talking to comrades and friends whose views and experience I deeply respect, and I'm still really short on answers. So how about this? Let's listen. And yes, I include myself in that. Let's listen to the stories we're uncomfortable with, the stories that don't fit neatly into the social change boxes we've created. The stories not just of the educated and articulate, but deep into the misery and fight for survival that some of our brothers and sisters face every day. Let's remind ourselves that organising the already organised is gratified, but ultimately an act of vanity. Listening is tough, and listening to tough, calloused hearts or angry hearts or dispirited hearts changes the world. Let's make spaces to listen. Let's amplify voices. Let's think about the voices in our own lives, in our own communities and workplaces that are not being heard, and quietly and gently encourage them. Let's turn hashtags into deep questions, questions about communities and questions about ourselves. Let's listen, because when we listen, we hear ourselves. And to me, that's the sincerest act of solidarity we can perform. Thanks so much for being here, everybody.